Well, hey guys, welcome to Scientific Inquiry in the Living World. This is our first lesson. We're going to overview some of the big takeaways for this week. At this point, you've already participated in learning activities, you've done the reading, you've done the homework, and even the weekly quiz. So you've got a good understanding of kind of the basics of science. What I want to do in this brief lesson is help you think about some of the bigger picture takeaways, particularly with that faith integration piece. So first, we're going to talk about what is science and wrestle with the idea of this conflict between science and faith, and try to kind of make some sense of that, kind of a framework for pulling that conflict apart and understanding it. Second, we're going to think about scientific theory. So thinking about how science works, how we get to theories, where theories come from, what a theory is meant to do, and kind of in doing that, we'll go through the scientific method. And then finally, we'll end with this idea of what does it mean to be made in God's image, and how does that impact how we think about life and how we do science. So first, what is science? This is the textbook definition of science. Science is the pursuit of knowledge through systematic observation, experimentation, and the formulation of theories to explain natural phenomena. That's a big definition, but it's important to start there. Science is first and foremost a process, right? It's a process of using observation, experimentation, reason, logic, assumptions that nature is predictable and ordered. And then from there, we can test hypotheses, right? Answers to questions we have about natural phenomena. So let's kind of summarize what that means and unpack it a little bit. For one, it means that science is not just a collection of facts and information. Science is that, right? When we have years of experimentation that lead to theories, and those theories are tested, we get these truths about nature and about the process that we're dealing with in nature that we can use to apply and inform our understanding and our application of that. But science is also a process, right? Science isn't stagnant. Science is being done every day in laboratories, and even less formally, just by humans being humans. So science is this process that we know as the scientific method. Science is essentially a search for these laws that govern the universe, theories then that we can use to understand the universe. The key here is that science then is limited to phenomena that are measurable, right? Phenomena about the physical world. So that means we cannot directly answer metaphysical questions, right? We couldn't design experiments to answer emotional, ethical, metaphysical, spiritual questions. So that is true of science. Science is limited in that way. Now we can use scientific findings to make metaphysical conclusions, right? But in order to do that, we have to hook that science to a worldview. And that's a big part of what I want to help you guys wrestle with in this course. And if you're reading the Bloom text that he'll really unpack for you, is that we have to really get that straight, kind of understand the limitations of science, where science stops and where worldview picks up. Next, science is influenced by society and culture. What that means is that there are societal norms, ethical standards in various societies that are doing science that kind of shape the agenda, the purpose, the goals of science, and even kind of limitations to the questions that can be asked and explored in that society. Also, science is expensive, right? It takes people who are working to do it. It takes tools and resources that sometimes are quite expensive, millions of dollars. I worked in a biomedical research lab in my master's degree, and then 2 years after, before I started teaching. And even just in our kind of basic research, where we're looking at cancer research, working with cells and tissue culture, we were working with $1 million grants, right? My salary was being paid, the equipment was expensive. All that to say, the process of getting grants and seeking funding and deciding to fund a project, that is all influenced by society and culture, and particularly human bias, right? So that's the last one I want to mention, is that science has a lot of limitations. It's a tool, but it's limited. It's limited by bias. Now, we have mechanisms to try to avoid that bias, but at the end of the day, it's really impossible to do science through the whole process without any effects of bias, because it's a human process. Science is also limited by previous knowledge, right? So we can only ask questions and test hypotheses based on our previous understanding. And then when new ideas come along, we have limited tools, right? Sometimes we don't have the tools to make those discoveries. So there are a lot of those in the history of science, right? The ability to look at the cell, to look at these molecular systems. It wasn't until we had microscopes and then more sophisticated microscopes and imaging, and then we learned about the cell, we learned about molecular biology. Each time a tool is added, it increases our ability to go further in those questions. And then science is limited to our ability to control variables, right? One of the hallmarks of science is experimentation, right? There are other ways to ask scientific questions and collect data and make conclusions, but experimentation is really the key. And we're about to go through that process here briefly, but sometimes we can't control variables. We just don't have a way to control those variables. Sometimes when we isolate a scenario in a lab, in an experiment, we remove it from the kind of the real nature variables so that make our conclusions almost irrelevant to nature. And then sometimes we don't know what we don't know, right? So we don't know the variables to control in order to design an experiment well. So those are some of the limitations of science. So science versus faith. This is a poll from the Pew Research Center last year. About 59% of Americans believe that science and religion are in conflict. What do you think, right? You guys participated in that discussion. I've read some of your posts. It really comes down to how we define science, right? What do we mean when we say science? And ultimately that comes down to worldview, right? So the real conflict between science and faith is a bigger conflict between worldview, two different worldviews. Science by itself is a tool. We just talked about it, right? It's this process of deductive reasoning. It makes assumptions about the natural world that there is order and rhythm. But then there are assumptions of a worldview. So without getting into too big of a discussion here, a worldview is bigger. It's kind of a comprehensive view of how a person thinks about reality, right? A worldview gives answers to questions like, where did we come from? What's the meaning of life? What went wrong with the world? How do we fix it? What's our hope? These big kind of comprehensive worldview questions. And there's a lot of things that shape our worldview, right? Religion is a part of that. Our culture, our teaching, our family rearing. So in our culture, particularly when I say culture, I mean our modern American culture, after the Enlightenment period, when reason kind of supplanted a belief in God as a kind of a main idea in Western culture, and we got to this postmodern society and now kind of a relativistic society. At some point along the way, science and naturalism became fused together. And so when you read a scientific textbook, when you take a typical scientific lecture, there's science, but there are also these worldview implications that are taught as one and the same. And what I want to help you see, hope this makes sense, is that science understood simply and rightly is a tool that can fit with a number of worldviews, right? We could take naturalism, right, and use science to kind of play with that worldview and shape and inform that worldview. But we could also take science and another worldview, theism, right, particularly Christian theism, biblical worldview, and that can play well together, right? So the real conflict isn't necessarily between science and faith, but this bigger worldview, this science-based worldview, if you will, called naturalism. Naturalism has a lot of presuppositions. You can read more about naturalism. The Bloom textbook will talk about it. But basically, naturalism is this worldview that excludes fundamentally, presuppositionally, any divine being, right? So that worldview assumes there is no supernatural, there is no God, and that is a worldview assumption. That is not a scientific reality. Hope that makes sense. So science is this discipline that we can use to understand nature. Naturalism is this worldview that says there can't be a God, there can't be spiritual things, and so everything has to be naturally explainable, right? So you see where the confusion comes from. So summing that up, science and faith, it really comes down to how we define science, and the real conflict is between worldviews, particularly naturalism and Christianity. Okay, so let's think about how we do science then. This is familiar to you. You've read it. But science is this process, right? I like this diagram. This, see if I can use my tool here. This continuum of moving from an observation to questions to conclusions, right? That's the purpose of science. But I like this diagram because it shows that every one of these steps involves reading published literature, right? Kind of consulting scientists, looking at what we already know. That's important, right? That's important to the integrity of science. That's important to the validity of science. It's important to mitigating some of the bias that we talked about. So anyway, let's kind of walk through this. So first we have observations. We make observations about the natural world. Again, these are measurable phenomena, not necessarily observable per se, because there are things that we know to be scientific that we can't directly observe. Gravity, for example, atomic particles even. Now as tools become available, we can measure indirectly some of these things, but the point is, it doesn't always have to be observable, but it has to be measurable and it has to be physical, right? It has to be a part of the physical world. At any rate, those observations lead us to ask questions. Why does it work this way? How does it work this way? We may do preliminary experiments, but we look at what we already know and we use that to form a hypothesis. A hypothesis is our kind of predicted answer to our research questions. Then we go and we test that hypothesis. Again, we can do that through a number of ways, through observation, but ultimately through experimentation, right? Where we isolate variables. We take our independent variable, which is the one we think is kind of the culprit in the change we're seeing. It's the one that we control and we manipulate. And then the dependent variable, that's the one that's responding. That's the data we're measuring. Right? So in this example here, the drug, whether you take the drug or a placebo being a fake, a substitute, that would be the independent variable, right? And the dependent would be blood pressure. Okay, so then we're going to measure those data, use statistics, kind of see if there's a relationship. We're not going to get into statistics too much, but that's a tool that we use. And then ultimately, we're going to draw conclusions. We're going to think about how does this fit into what we already know with our theoretical framework. Are there new theories that are emerging? And again, all of this goes back to the scientific community. We're going to publish it, submit it to the process of peer review. And that's important. So again, we ask questions and formulate a hypothesis. Again, a hypothesis is a tentative statement. It's our predicted answer to a research question. So drug X is an effective treatment for high blood pressure in humans, right? If it worked in rats, maybe it'll work in humans, right? So kind of following that clinical trial. Then we got to design an experiment to test that and make observations. These hypotheses have to be testable, have to be observable, and our experiment has to be controlled. Simply put, controls mean as best we can, we want to make sure there aren't any confounding variables, right? Extraneous variables that could impact our dependent variable and affect the way we interpret it. If we don't account for that, then we really have no grounds for our conclusion, right? We can't say it was our independent variable. In this case, we can't say it was a drug. Maybe it was some other variable, a pre-existing condition, exercise, sleep patterns, you name it, right? So there are a lot of ways to control that. Sorry if this is tiny. This is in your book, but one gold standard, particularly when it comes to medicine, is a random sample, and we're going to do a blind study, particularly a double-blind study. So let me break that down. We've got a population, right? The general population, various ages. These are working adults, various genders, various ethnics. So we got the whole population that we're concerned with, and we're going to randomly sample. That's hard. It's really hard to get a true random sample, but that's the idea. We're going to get a random sample, and then we're going to randomly take half that group and put them in the experimental group, in this case, the one that receives the blood pressure medication, and half of them are going to go into the placebo or the control group, right? They're going to get a sugar pill, a fake. They're not going to know which one they are, whether they're getting the real drug or the placebo, so we minimize that kind of placebo effect. And in a double blind, that means the researcher, right, the people who are collecting the data, they don't know which patients are the receiving the drug and which are receiving the placebo, so there can't be any bias there. Someone else, a third party, would keep track of participation, and then at the end, when you're making conclusions, then you would see who was in the experiment, who was in the control. But during the experiment, that's blind to both the participants and the experimenter. And then we do the study, right? So in this case, maybe they take the drug once a day for a month, and they're going to get blood pressure recordings daily. And we're going to track average blood pressure over time. We're going to see, is there a difference? Was the mean blood pressure, the average blood pressure of the drug group lower than the placebo, right? If it was, then We're going to support our hypothesis. It seems to be that this drug affects blood pressure in humans. If not, then we're going to reject it and kind of go back to the drawing board. So that's the process of drawing conclusions. Again, when we make conclusions, we're going to see how it fits in our theory. We're going to think about limitations. But at the end of the day, we support or reject our hypothesis. And both of those are good things. Now, remember, science is tentative. We can't ever absolutely prove something. That just has to do with the nature of science. We're always working with a sample. We're not measuring the whole population. We have limited tools, limited ability to control variability, statistics that are involved, right? So there's always this tentative nature. We can be pretty conclusive, but we can never absolutely say, this has been proven. It's seldom to kind of make that firm cause and effect. So typically we say we support a hypothesis or we reject our hypothesis. So I don't want to get too much into this, but that peer review process is important. You've probably heard about peer review, but this means before scientific findings are made available to the public, they should go through a process of peer review. So that means myself and my team, we're experts in the field. We've done our experiment. We've written it up, and we're ready to share it with the world. Before we do that, we reach out to a journal. So this might be Nature or Science, or some of the ones I published to were the American Journal of Neurology or Lung Physiology, right? Because that's the work I did. But I'm going to submit my manuscript to them, where I show my findings, my conclusions, my background research. They're going to thank me for my submission, send it to a panel of expert reviewers, people who are experts in the field. They're going to look at the validity of my study, going to pick it apart, and then most of the time they're going to get back to me and say, thanks for your submission, but we noticed you didn't cite this study. We noticed you made this assumption, you used this drug and not this one. Your sample size is too low, et cetera, et cetera. And they're going to say, fix these things, address these concerns, and then bring it back to us. That process is really important. It doesn't automatically verify my study. So even if I get passed through peer review, it doesn't mean it's mitigated all my bias or validates my study, but it helps. It's an important step in minimizing that bias, right? Minimizing the kind of blindness that a researcher would have to their own study. Okay, so theory versus hypothesis. A hypothesis is tested in an experiment. We just talked about that. It's our kind of predicted answer to our research question. Hypotheses can eventually become, or multiple hypotheses can lead to shape a theory, right? So a theory is an explanation of kind of how that process works. So simply put, a hypothesis is a mature theory. Sometimes in our American language, we use theory in a kind of pejorative way, meaning, oh, it's just a theory. It's kind of a wild guess. But in science, theories are the best we have. Theories can be refuted. As we get more information, we can move paradigms. There could also be competing theories. But a theory is one part of science, right? It explains how. Another is a law. Laws are more descriptive, right? The law of gravity, for example. So laws tell us kind of with a high degree of certainty what happens, right, mathematically, and then theories come in and try to explain how and why that happens, right? So we got the law of gravity, and then we've got theory, Newton's theories of physics, and then Einstein's theory, right? And they're going to have different explanations of how this gravity works, for example. So I hope that makes sense. Theories are, in science, explanations of how and why a phenomenon works. Laws are a part of that, but they're more descriptive, right? They explain what happens kind of with mathematical precision. Okay, last thing I want to talk about in this lecture is what separates us from animals. We're going to get into this a lot in the class. We're going to talk about worldviews. We're going to talk about evolution. What is scientific with evolution, and what is a worldview? Right? Again, we're going to try to pull those things apart. But a big part of that is how we view humans, right? From a naturalistic worldview, humans are just evolved species, right? They're a part of nature. They're not special. They're not spiritual, right? Again, that's a worldview. That's not necessarily science. That's a worldview assumption, and then science kind of is grafted onto that. Similarly, as Christians, right, we believe that we are spiritual and physical beings, that humans were created from this earth, right? Genesis 1, God formed Adam of the dust, and he breathed life into him. He took the rib from Adam and made Eve, right? They were made from this earth, for this earth, but they're spiritual beings, right? We believe that humans are God's image bearers. We are separated from creation in that way. So we are nature, we are a part of nature, but we are God's special creation, right? He has a covenantal relationship with us. We bear his image. We can sin against God. We can go to hell. We are responsible for our sin. We need to be redeemed by Jesus, right? Animals, other parts of nature don't have that relationship. This is fundamental to the biblical worldview. And I think as Christian scientists, it's important to how we think about science, right? So again, this is kind of helping you peel those naturalism implications from science. So being made in the image of God has moral and ethical implications. Again, humans are spiritual and physical beings. We bear God's image. We know from the biblical story that we sinned, right? Adam and Eve originally sinned. We inherit their sin nature, and we also have our own sin nature. And we need to be reconciled to God, right? That sin has broken our relationship with God. Scripture, Romans chapter 8 tells us it broke creation, right? All of creation longs to be restored, Romans chapter 8. But we know that Jesus is the perfect image bearer, right? So although our sin distorts our ability to image God, Jesus is the perfect image bearer. He's the Son of God. He's God himself, part of the Trinity. And so through his substitutionary life, death, and resurrection, by grace through faith, we can be reconciled to God. So that's the gospel that we believe, and that's important to how we think about science. Why is that important how we think about science? Well, it has ethical implications, right? It helps us to kind of think about this worldview piece. From a Christian worldview, how we do science, how we think about science is going to be different than someone who's a naturalist, right? And who does science through naturalism. So again, that worldview piece is important. As humans, we have responsibility to steward the earth, right? If we look at the creation mandate in Genesis, God created Adam and Eve in the garden, and he charged them to be fruitful and multiply. Right? If we look at Revelation, the picture of redemption is a new heaven and a new earth, right? Adam failed, Jesus will succeed, right? In Adam, all men die and sin against God. In Jesus, sins are forgiven and we are reconciled to God. So the picture is a physical reality, right? One day our dead physical bodies will be resurrected and we'll live in a new creation, a new heaven, a new earth that Jesus is preparing, kind of this garden city. So we have responsibility, right? Thinking about being made in God's image, thinks about impacts how we think about nature, how we steward earth, how we think about our life, how we treat human life compared to non-human life. There are a lot of implications there. So again, being made in God's image, you'd expect that we see characteristics of God show up in humanity, and we do, right? Just some examples: morality, justice, rationale, spirituality, kind of design and beauty, that aesthetic sense, symbolism, story, imagination, art. All these are expressions that are unique to humans, right? Because we bear God's image. So again, as images, we're created to image, right? We're created to reflect something about God. Anyway, I don't want to get on a rabbit trail with that. That's a big doctrinal thing in biblical theology. But I just want to help you see that in this class, and as Christians, our worldview shapes how we think about science, right? Whereas a naturalist, their worldview also shapes how they think about science. And that's really where the tension is. Not between science and faith, but between these two competing worldviews that are kind of behind the science. Anyway, I hope that's helpful. Sorry, this is a little bit longer than I wanted it to be, but I hope it's helpful. If you have any questions, reach out to me. I'll post another one of these soon, kind of getting into the chemistry. For now, have a great day. Be blessed.